I know what I want. I know what kind of god I need to be for you.
Hey, welcome back, ScreenCrush. I'm Ryan Airy, and this is all of the Easter eggs, references, and little things you might have missed in the series finale of Loki.
Yeah, what happened with that ending?
Well, I know a lot of you have questions about the ending, and we actually have answers. Actually, all of this pretty much happened in a comic book that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. And that comic perfectly ties into Secret Wars, giving us some big clues about how Loki will fit into the endgame of the multiverse saga. So the name of this episode is Glorious Purpose, which was also the name of the pilot episode, taken from this quote.
And I am burdened with glorious purpose.
Now, in the pilot, the title was meant to be ironic. Loki is shown that he has no glorious purpose. His role in myth, and in the MCU, is only to be the villain so others can succeed. But in this episode, we actually do see Loki's glorious purpose. He gets a throne, but in doing so, his worst fears come true.
I don't want to be alone.
I will say though, this show had a lot of bittersweet endings. Loki is alone, and Mobius has to watch a jet ski on dry land from afar. So now, the closest we'll ever get to seeing Mobius on a jet ski is on our Mobius Jet Ski t-shirt available at ScreenCrushMerch.com, the merch store where we design all the shirts ourselves. Guys, shopping our merch store is the best way for you to directly support what we do here. We've also got the ScreenCrush variant hoodie, the creepy Miss Minutes pinup, Doug as Loki, and the usual variants t-shirt, my personal favorite. And we have also just announced our very first live show in Brooklyn, New York. Buy a ticket, come meet us, say hello, and we're going to show exclusive videos. That's on February 22nd in Brooklyn, New York. The link is below. Now, giving the finale the same name as the pilot is yet another Ouroboros loop for the show. As we've talked about many times on the channel, Loki is a character that is trapped in like perpetual loops. In ancient Norse, his name is translated from Lok, which means knot or loop. His actions institute Ragnarok, which causes the death and rebirth of the world, and then like everything starts all over again.
Boom. The end. Start again.
And in the MCU, Loki is trapped in a villainous cycle where he is never able to grow or change because he always feels like he has to be the villain.
See, Loki, life is about growth, it's about change, but you seem to just want to stay the same.
So this episode takes that idea of Loki being trapped in a time loop and makes it literal, with him desperately trying to rewrite history to avoid his fate. And actually, this is also something that Mephisto does in the comics, but we're not going to go down that road in this video. And of course, we've talked about how all season long this season is a giant Ouroboros loop, even introducing a character named Ouroboros.
It's like a snake eating its own tail.
The best example of this is how Loki from the future has to prune Loki from the past so he can become Loki from the future. You get the idea. So the episode begins with the Marvel Studios intro playing backwards as Loki is slipping backwards through time. Now this is a kind of time travel commonly known as becoming unstuck in time, like the character Billy Pilgrim in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5. It's a kind of time travel where you constantly leap backward into your own body. So this whole sequence where he is constantly repeating history and trying to rewrite the past is of course also like the time loop movie Groundhog Day, where every single time Bill Murray loops through a single day, he becomes just a little bit better at something. In fact, a great example of this kind of story is actually in the final season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Just like in this episode, the character who is looping through time has to find all sorts of shortcuts to get everybody caught up on their situation. The music during this montage is the 1976 disco hit A Fifth of Beethoven, which is actually a very early example of a remix. In this case, taking a piece of classical music and then remixing it into a disco hit. And that's exactly what Loki is trying to do in this montage. He's trying to take an old story, the death of his friends, and remake it into something new. But much like disco, he is doomed.
Oh, just a second, person. Hello? Why, certainly. I would love to provide you with my social security number. It's 5...
Hang up, Doug.
But they say I have won a major prize.
Dude, it's a robocall. It's a scam. Hang it up.
But they seem so nice. How did they get my number?
Well, dude, that's actually the messed up part about this that nobody actually wants you to know. They got your number and email address from online data brokers. The internet is filled with shady people who will pay big money just for access to your private data. And I know this because I also used to get a ton of spam phone calls and emails.
Oh, you don't get those calls anymore?
Very rarely, because I signed up for Incogni. They're the sponsor of this video. Incogni is by far one of the best products we talk about on this channel. I mean, this is the app that they do not want you to know about. You would be shocked how much of your personal information is just out there on the internet, like your address and your phone number. Incogni found over 100 data brokers that were selling my sensitive information. I mean, we're talking about financial details, health history, internet search history, and they were selling this information to the highest bidder.
Sold for $2.7 million. Thank you.
Several of these were rated 10 out of 10 for data sensitivity, and they were selling personal information about potential health risks, insurance provider, my credit card, really scary stuff.
Or how'd they get all that private data?
Well, companies can get your info so easy that it's scary. Like if you sign up for a loyalty card, then these companies will sell your data to giant firms called data brokers that then sell your information to advertisers. But here's the thing, guys. These data brokers legally have to remove your name from their database if you ask them to.
But I don't have time to contact companies and do all that. I'm just a little dog and I am so small.
Yes, but that is where Incogni comes in. They contact those companies for you. You don't have to do anything and they alert you when the request has been completed. After signing up, I get almost no spam, and I cannot even remember the last time I got a phone call from my old friend unknown number. So I highly recommend giving Incogni a try. Use my code ScreenCrush with the link below to get 60% off an Incogni plan. It is a great deal that you don't want to miss. Now, back to what I was saying. So what we really have here is Loki trying to change fate and rewrite history, which also happens in the comics. So like all season long, I've been focused on how this show fits within the MCU and the multiverse saga, and I've kind of ignored the comics. But starting with episode 5, the comics have become very relevant to the story, and especially to this ending, so I want to explain some of the more recent comics and how the show has adapted them. And this could also give us an idea of what's about to happen in Avengers Secret Wars. So there was a book called Loki, Agent of Asgard, which reinvented the villain to make him a bit more like he is in the MCU. A very long story short, Loki was reborn as a young person and then his older spirit possessed that body. But this wasn't actually a scheme. Loki genuinely wanted to have a second chance. He wanted to try to be good. He wanted to break his cycle of villainy and be reborn as a hero. And this is exactly what we see Loki doing in this show, trying to prove he's not a villain and trying to break his own vicious cycle that goes all the way back to myth and is retold in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Becoming predictable. I trust you. You betray me round and round in circles we go.
And this show examines this on a meta level, with Loki trying to break this time loop of the multiversal war, causing the deaths of all these timelines, he who remains winning, forming the TVA, dying, starting the multiversal war. You get my point. So in the Agent of Asgard comic, Loki's main antagonist is his evil self from the future. Old Loki represents a path that is set in stone, where Loki will always end up being alone and unloved. Similar to how in this episode, Loki's path seems to be fixed in stone. There is no way for him to save the TVA without killing Sylvie.
Kill her, and we protect what we can.
Old Loki even has the ability to travel through time like Loki does in this episode. In fact, the comic has an Ouroboros loop of its own, when young Loki uses a magic sword to trap old Loki's spirit, and then old Loki goes back in time to make sure that the sword comes into existence so he can control it in the future. Now, that arc of comics ends with Loki becoming the god of stories. He used to be the god of lies, but since lies are essentially stories, he's able to take control of his own story and rewrite the future. Now, all of this happens on the backdrop of Secret Wars. So, as Loki is breaking this cycle of Ragnarok and rebirth, the entire multiverse was destroyed, leading to its rebirth following Avengers Secret Wars. And of course, that's the inspiration for the ending of this story, which I'm going to explain a little bit later.
So wait, every time Loki time travels, is he making a new timeline?
No. Well, okay, so normally in the MCU, whenever you time travel, you create a branch. It's what the Avengers did in Endgame. But because Loki is time slipping within the TVA, his time travel is actual retrocausality, meaning the future Loki can affect his past. It's more like how time travel in Back to the Future works.
Oh yeah, okay, gotcha.
So he speed runs through the last few episodes and we get a repeat of one of my favorite Back to the Future Easter eggs in the show, OB's model that's not to scale.
Victor, this model is not finished, okay? There's only one coat of paint on this.
Please excuse the crudity of this model. I didn't have time to build it to scale or to paint it.
And there are a few other similarities to Groundhog Day in there. Bill Murray uses his years trapped in a time loop to become a great piano player, just as Loki becomes a theoretical physicist on par with OB. And in Groundhog Day, Phil Connors has to accept that no matter what, the old homeless man in town will always die, just as Loki has to eventually accept that the loom will always explode. Now, I loved this sequence, especially how Loki already knows how to correct all of these dumb mistakes.
Whatever you do not set the multiplier down or it will roll off the gangway.
It's also a lot like Baby Groot setting off the bomb.
Now, whatever you do, don't push this button.
Hit the green button.
You can just see Loki in the past having to redo all these mistakes over and over again, but he's still being very patient with everyone. I mean, after all, he is a god, so he's like 1,500 years old, so what's a few more centuries spent learning physics?
Physics.
All of this, though, is so tragic because it shows how much Loki is trying to hold on to these people in his life. Like he admitted in the last episode,
I controlled it.
Learn to control your time slipping.
He can time slip, he can go anywhere, and he went, but he just wants these people, the only people in existence he can actually never be with. Aww. Now you might have noticed something weird in this scene.
Pumpkin.
Well, I was curious about that, and I found an NPR article about old-timey slang. In an 1891 book about slang words, pumpkins was referenced as being like a big trade, like a major event occurring.
Let's get back out there and show that other team why our life expectancy is only 39 years.
Loki learns that the real reason the room keeps failing is because the multiverse is infinite, so the timelines will increase exponentially. So Loki is once again done in by infinity, just like how in the main timeline he was murdered by somebody with infinity stones.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
So then he goes back to the true moment that destabilized time, when Sylvie killed He Who Remains in the season 1 finale. And then Loki has to relive one of his worst memories ever, over and over and over. Just like his TVA time cell, where he had to loop one of his worst memories when Sif told him,
"You deserve to be alone and you always will be."
Now in that time loop, no matter what Loki did or said, events always turned out the same way. And it turns out that her words were prophecy, as Loki ends up being alone at the end of the series.
Good job.
So Loki and Sylvie fight over and over, and notice how subtly the point of view starts to shift over to He Who Remains. We see the event from over his shoulder, from his perspective, subtly indicating that he has written all of this down and he is watching his story unfold.
Why are you telling my life story to these guys?
And with each loop, we hear his last words.
Do you see?
Now, we always took this to mean that he was referencing like the big MCU time loop. Eventually, the multiversal war will start again, he wins the war, forms the TVA, and then he sees Sylvie back in the same spot. But now, it's like he was actually speaking to Loki, knowing that every time he died, he was actually bringing Loki one step closer to this conversation. And then it turns out that Loki has been on the path paved by He Who Remains this entire time.
I know about the slipping. And who do you think paved that road?
Yeah, so what is it that He Who Remains actually wanted to happen?
Well, I'm going to explain his actual plan later in the video when I talk about the ending, but I will say that he already told us his plan in the finale of season 1. It's very simple, and maybe we're a tad guilty on our end for overthinking it.
Not the beast!
Now, there are a couple sly references thrown into this conversation. At one point, He Who Remains says,
Survey says?
Which is from the game show Family Feud, but it's not just a throwaway line though. The answers on Family Feud are taken from random people surveyed in a shopping mall.
Hey, person, I'm gonna tell my joke now, okay? So there's these 2 muffins, right?
Doug, not right now, we're doing an Easter egg video. Then, after He Who Remains reveals this has been his plan all along, Loki says,
We die with the dying, we're born with the dead.
Yeah, what is that, some kind of Norse poetry?
No, that is a verse from the great T.S. Eliot.
He of J. Alfred Prufrock fame?
The very same, high five. This is from a poem called Little Getting, and the opening verse is, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. Essentially, as soon as you have begun to do something, you have also begun to stop doing that, because that's the nature of time. Everything that ends has a beginning, everything that has a beginning will always end. And the full verse that Loki quotes is, we die with the dying, see they depart, and we go with them. We are born with the dead, see they return and bring us with them. Because He Who Remains was dead, but he was still able to bring Loki back with him. Like, look, I could do a whole breakdown just of this poem. T.S. Eliot is the man. But the poem broadly is about the passage of time and humanity's need for purification through fire. Now, there's also a lot of imagery surrounding time, about ancient trees essentially being the same age as a rose when you weigh that against the length of eternity. Now, the end of the poem even speaks of a crowned knot of fire, just like the knots of the timelines that Loki brings together to make a crown for himself at the end of this episode. But the imagery of the trees and eternity also calls to mind Yggdrasil. That's the world tree from Norse mythology, which has a huge connection to this ending that I'm going to talk about in just a bit. And Cashflow03 on Twitter had another great insight about this poem. It's about humanity's flawed understanding of life and turning away from God, and how that leads to a cycle of warfare. But this can be overcome by recognizing the lessons of the past, which is exactly what Loki does in this finale. It's a god learning from the past and breaking a circle of death and warfare. When He Who Remains is messing with Loki, he pretends to struggle to predict the future.
You're having some problems with the temporal loom.
And this is actually from an old Johnny Carson bit where he would be a seer named Karnak the Magnificent.
Sheep and husbands. What does Elizabeth Taylor count to help fall asleep?
Then he reveals his ultimate trump card, that no matter what, the sacred timeline always wins. The loom is a failsafe designed to prune all the variant timelines if it fails, and this is why, in episode 5, the screen said, failsafe initiated. It's why the TVA workers were put back on their timelines, because the branches were all about to be pruned, and then He Who Remained would rebuild the TVA after the multiversal war. And he tells Loki that no matter what,
you lose.
And this is Loki's true, glorious purpose, to make others great. He even calls this a burden that he carries. Now, originally, Loki thought this meant that he was so great that he had to rule over others. It was his duty.
You were made to be ruled.
But this episode shows us that his glorious purpose was to rule, and it truly is a burden. He ends up separated from everyone he loves. He Who Remains says something very interesting here.
My variants are already out there.
Now look, at this particular time, the variants have not been set loose on the multiverse yet, but he knows that because Loki is time-slipping, that means that he was stabbed in the chest, which means that in the future, where Loki comes from, his variants are all running amok. So this is showing how He Who Remains has like a fourth-dimensional view of time, like he's viewing it like it's all happening at once. The entire show is about fate versus free will. Loki, as an agent of chaos, represents free will, so now it's appropriate that he tries to find a way to break He Who Remains' equation. He Who Remains acts like he's heard this all before.
And around and around and around we go.
So the choice here boils down to he has to kill Sylvie to protect the TVA. Now, the old Loki from the Avengers would not have hesitated. He would have killed her in a heartbeat. But now he's trying to be good. He wants to be merciful. So he seeks the advice of the most merciful man he knows, Mobius. And then Mobius gives him his backstory, that he and Renslayer used to be partners, but she was way more ruthless than him and he's more suited to a desk job. Now this explains their long friendship that they talked about in season 1. But the real point of this talk is that Mobius teaches Loki an important lesson about the burden to rule.
Most purpose is more burden than glory.
In other words, when you rule, you will be unhappy. He Who Remains was basically the master of time, the master of everything, but he wasn't able to use time to make himself happy. His glorious purpose was to keep the variants from starting a multiversal war. His burden was that he was alone forever. And then Mobius becomes spaghetti, but I think this is just an effect of showing time slipping from Loki's point of view as he comes back to Sylvie to say goodbye. Sylvie tells him that the point of free will is not just to win, it's to fight, and to have the ability to keep fighting. Like free will is its own reward. And then it dawns on him that he can't just let the TVA be destroyed or let He Who Remains stay alive. He has to actually replace this system with something better. So he takes one last moment to be with his friends before going off and doing the old Spock in the radiation chamber from Wrath of Khan.
I know what kind of God I need to be for you.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
No, actually the sign here says high chronoton levels, and chronotons are a fake radiation that was invented in Star Trek for time travel episodes.
Yeah, they know what they were doing.
Yeah, they did. So now we're getting into explaining the ending and He Who Remains' real plan. So one last thing he told Loki was that to rule, to have the big chair, you have to make tough choices. In this moment, Loki took that to mean that you have to make sacrifices, like killing the ones you love, killing Sylvie. But that's what old Loki would have done. The old Loki did take the throne of Asgard, and he was a terrible ruler. He used the throne to put on plays about himself and to lounge around and eat grapes, and probably having sex with women who called out his father's name. The old Loki had issues. But the new Loki finally understands what He Who Remains meant by this. The tough decision is not to sacrifice others, it's to sacrifice yourself. So Loki takes this long walk. Instead of placing others in danger, he's going to place himself in danger.
I know what I want.
Remember, OB kept warning that this radiation would peel the skin off your body. And what else sheds its skin?
Willem Dafoe.
No, why Willem Dafoe doesn't shed his skin?
Are you sure? I think I saw him shed his skin once.
No, dude, a snake sheds its skin.
Oh yeah, a snake, okay.
Yeah, and Loki even once turned himself into a snake.
He transformed himself into a snake, and he knows that I love snakes. So I went to pick up the snake to admire it, and he transformed back into himself, and he was like, yeah, it's me, and he stabbed me.
So, as he approaches the loom, he sheds his old clothes, his old skin. Clothes often define a job, and this is Loki transitioning from a servant to an Asgardian king. He even grows out his horns like the Loki from mythology, and the channel Heavy Spoilers pointed out that the material of the horns looks like it's made from the same material that makes up the palace of He Who Remains. Very cool detail from a really fun channel over at Heavy Spoilers, even though the guy is a f***ing. Then he uses his full power for the first time to destroy the loom and to sever all of the different timelines. And this is framed just like old Loki fighting off Goliath in episode 5 last season. And old Loki even invoked the name of this episode. He enchants the severed timelines, using them to open a rift to what's left of the palace of He Who Remains. This whole scene is like another Ouroboros bringing Loki's story full circle. The first time we met Loki, he watched his brother ascend the steps to take the throne of Asgard, and now he is the one ascending to a larger throne. Basically, Loki has learned the same lesson Thor did in the first movie, that you have to sacrifice your own happiness to be worthy to rule. It just took Loki a lot longer to learn that lesson. But both of them learned that the first duty of a ruler is to serve his people and not for his people to serve him. But then we see the gold kintsugi cracks that held the fortress together slowly form a throne for Loki to sit upon. And as he takes all of these timelines, they weave around him like a cloak. And, just like in the comic, he becomes the god of stories. So this was actually foreshadowed last episode when he gained the ability to control his time slipping when he remembered OB's words about science and fiction.
Focus in on that why. You need to save the TVA.
So when he re-energizes the timelines with his green energy, they form the shape of Yggdrasil, the World Tree.
Oh, what's that?
Well, Yggdrasil is from Norse mythology. It's a great tree that held the 9 realms within its branches. In the first Thor movie, Thor drew it for Jane and told her that there were basically planets inside of the tree.
Our world is one of the 9 realms of the cosmos, linked to each other by the branches of Yggdrasil, the world's tree.
And of course, in Captain America First Avenger, the Red Skull took the Tesseract from a wall carving of Yggdrasil. So all of this goes back to that T.S. Eliot poem, which talked about remaking the world through fire, and that compared a rose to the lifespan of a tree. The sacred timeline was a rose, a single stem, very fragile.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
But the tree here at the end is much stronger, woven together from many branches that strengthen one another.
Hey, the tree also kind of looks like a wormhole.
It does, yeah. Any idea why it would look like a...
No.
Okay then, back in the new TVA, we see a new poster, this time of a mighty tree that reads, "Let's grow together." And then we find out that this new TVA has a new purpose, to keep tabs on the variants of He Who Remains. So this is a bit more in line with what the TVA does in the comics. The TVA are more like time police who go after time offenders like Kang.
Your time is all ripped up to hell! You broke your time twice!
But the TVA are keeping their existence a secret so no variants will try to come after them. Mobius says,
I guess one of them caused a little bit of a ruckus on 616 adjacent realm, but they handled it,
So like, that shoots down a lot of fan theories for us. He, of course, is referencing Kang the Conqueror from Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. We even see shots of Kang in the file that he's holding. So this is the guy that we thought was going to be a big, scary big bad who has now been reduced to a footnote by Mobius. He still could come back, though. He still could be the big bad. I really like that character. I want to see him come back. He also calls the quantum realm an adjacent realm, which is interesting. It makes me wonder if all of the other dimensions that we saw in the first Doctor Strange were like different universes. They were just realms adjacent to the 616 universe. Max Ackerman on Twitter, hey Max, pointed out that at the end, the TVA seems to be calling the timelines realms.
616 adjacent realm, but
maybe in reference to the 9 realms of the World Tree.
So they went full Norse.
They went full Norse. So when he asked Verity, aka Hunter B15, for his file, he says,
those who do not remember the past are,
And the other half of that saying is, are doomed to repeat it. And this is exactly what the TVA has been doing for millennia. The variants don't remember their past, so they have been repeating these same loops over and over and over, repeating their same old mistakes. But now, Mobius is finally breaking his own cycle and moving forward. Meanwhile, OB gets to write a 2nd edition TVA manual, even taking them out of a cardboard box, like his variant self, A.D. Doug, had boxes of his science fiction novels. So in the closing, we see that the TVA is now ruled by a council of people, and Ravonna Renslayer is in the void at the end of time, where it looks like she is being eaten by Eliath. But we do see that she is sitting on a pruned plaque from the TVA, which mirrored Mobius standing on the same plaque. The two of them have actually chosen very different paths. Mobius chose mercy, which led him to a happier existence. But notice one last Easter egg here. The pyramid in the background could be a reference to Rama-Tut, an earlier identity of Kang's when he traveled back to ancient Egypt, and we saw Rama-Tut in the post-credit scene of Quantumania. So you never know. This light shining on her might not be Eliath. This could be Rama-Tut arriving at the void at the end of time to recruit Renslayer to be his general in the multiversal war. In fact, Liam McGuire on Twitter even pointed out the Sphinx, which I missed. Now, in the comics, the Sphinx houses Rama-Tut's base and time machine. It is possible that the TVA pruned this Sphinx in the past. Ravonna sees it, recognizes it, and then outruns Eliath, gets to the time machine, and gets herself home.
What, like it's hard?
Mobius looks at his life on the timeline and tells Sylvie,
let time pass.
Because, up until now, he has never let time pass before. He has always controlled time, stopped time, guided time. But now, he can finally experience the flow of time. Now, as for Loki, his worst fear has come true. He is alone, and he always will be, but it's for a greater good. And we also see that nobody puts the TVA manual in the window of young Victor Timely, meaning that He Who Remains plans have stopped and the loop has been broken.
I'm free! Alright, so what was He Who Remains' plan then?
Well, it's simple. He already told us what his plan was in the finale of season 1. He wanted Sylvie or Loki to take his place because he was tired. I mean, he's Willy Wonka and Loki is Charlie Bucket. He had been ruling the timeline for countless eons, all by himself.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely, I have nobody.
So he wrote himself a path that would have freed him from this burden. He knew that Loki, the god of lies, aka the god of stories, was the person who could rule in his place. But Loki was not ready to rule yet. He could not handle the true burden of this glorious purpose. He had to discover a no-win scenario to truly step up and become a selfless person who could take on his worst fears in order to help others.
But how did he know all this?
Well look, He Who Remains could basically predict everything that happens because, in his younger days, he would have developed a probability drive like Kang the Conqueror's. Now this drive is used to predict probabilities, which help you to navigate the multiverse because you can predict the various timelines and where they'll branch. So He Who Remains needed to create an outcome where the TVA would still be intact, monitoring his variants, but he was no longer in charge.
I'm retiring.
There's even a subtle hint of this last season. When he meets them, he's eating an apple, and in Doctor Strange, an apple is used as a symbol of time manipulation. And in the real world, an apple rots, a seed grows, becomes a tree, makes an apple, it's another Ouroboros loop. Now Loki's throne at the end is also taken from mythology. The idea of a god being punished for all eternity to serve humans was part of Greek mythology when the Titan Atlas was forced to hold up the world. Thank you to Remy Ogburn for that observation. And Patio Furniture reminds us that in Norse mythology, Loki was responsible for the death of Balder, whose statue we saw in episode 3. And afterwards, Loki was chained up in the underworld until Ragnarok, similar to how Loki will be holding together these stories until the multiverse is rebooted in Secret Wars. Or as James and I on Twitter says, he's like Mimir, the Norse god of wisdom who lived in the roots of the World Tree. And at the end of this episode, Loki even creates a tree that governs all of time. A tree with branches like branches that can grow fruit like apples. And a tree is a perfect metaphor for a healthy timeline. The TVA does not have to prune the branches of this tree. They can let it grow and flourish while occasionally guiding its branches to not collide. King Pappas on Twitter even pointed out that this ending was foreshadowed all the way back in episode 1. Look how familiar the vacuum tubes are in OB's workstation, like the top of the World Tree. However, this does not mean this is all going to be a happy ending.
Happy ending.
The Kang variants are still out there. They're still going to go to war. And we know that incursions are still occurring. It's only a matter of time before the Kangs find out about the TVA and launch an attack. Then, in Secret Wars or Kang Dynasty, I think we'll see Loki freed from his glorious purpose to stand with the heroes against these variants. And then he will finally stop being called the god of mischief or the god of lies, and he'll be remembered as the god of stories. Well guys, thanks for watching our coverage of Loki. Just a reminder, we have a live show next year on February 22nd. Buy tickets with the link below. We also have a new membership program where you can join, get a custom Doug emoji, priority comment replies, and a loyalty badge. And look, if you have any comments or thoughts, things we missed, let me know in the comments below or at me on Twitter. And if it's your first time here, please subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Ryan Airy.
Okay, so here's my joke, right? So there's these two muffins and they're in an oven together, right? And one of them says, "Ooh, gee, it's getting kind of hot in here."